Welcome to episode 3 of Free Kiwis. I'm here with my colleague James Kierstead and with our guest Briar Lipson from the New Zealand Initiative. And Briar has recently had a report published. Welcome, Briar. Would you like to tell us a bit about your report?
Well, thank you for having me both. Yes, so my book, New Zealand's Education Delusion, How Bad Ideas Ruined a Once World-Leading School System, really tries to explain the underlying philosophy that has kind of taken over the official discourse and schooling policy in New Zealand very gradually over the last, as much as 70 years, but in particular in the last 2 decades. And over that period from the early 2000s, when the OECD started assessing school systems on their performance in basic areas like reading, maths and science, New Zealand's gone from being the envy of the world to decidedly mediocre. So we used to be 3rd in reading and maths for the whole world. The countries that were assessed, certainly the OECD countries, we're now 6th and 19th. In maths, our 13-and-a-half-year-olds now perform the way, our 15-year-olds now perform the way 13-and-a-half-year-olds did just 20 years ago. And over that time, inequity has remained a huge problem in New Zealand. We have the worst educational inequity of all English-speaking comparator countries. So that's worse than the US, Australia, Canada, the UK. And yet, despite that, the graph that goes down and down and down for basic maths, reading and science performance, NCA scores make it look like everything's got so much better. The book is an attempt to explain that by looking at the underlying philosophy that underpins schooling in New Zealand, which I refer to broadly as child-centred education. Yes,
so we'll come to child-centred education in a minute and sort of unpack what that means and its potential connection with the decline that you've described. It's probably I just wanted to note in regard to your observation that NCEA results have increased. I think it's quite telling that if you take NCEA level 3, for example, there's been a precipitous increase in the proportion of year 13 students who get that qualification. Although at the same time, the university entrance statistics, which essentially draw they're the same set of students, are completely flat over time. And I think that gives us a clue as to what's going on. NCA, being the highly flexible system that it is, allows a lot of picking and choosing about what to do, which assessments to do, and students frequently skip assessments they don't want to do, and schools might design programs of assessment in order to maximise the numbers of credits that students will get. So, whereas that's much more difficult to do because the university entrance requirement is from a much more circumscribed set of standards, and it seems as if the level 3 phenomenon is explained in terms of kind of game playing with the standards, which is much harder to do with UE. So.
Right, yeah. I just wanted to pick up that empirical point. So, if you're a hard-boiled skeptic, I suppose you could look. You have these graphs in the report, one I'm looking at right now, where the red line, the NCEA, just goes up, and all the other lines, which are PISA scores, basically go down and down. So if you're a hard-boiled skeptic, you could say, well, that just means that the PISA scores aren't measuring the right thing, and the NCEA the NCEA is measuring the right thing. So,
or if you're a hard-boiled cheerleader for child-centred education,
different ways of putting this. But
believe me, those hard-boiled cheerleaders are out there, and they're shouting, and they were ruffled by this report. And of course, that's one of the most frequently cited critiques of this thesis. And it was the one the ministry came out with rather pathetically in response that, that's because NCA measures something different. To which my response is, is that not a problem that we have a national assessment that tells us nothing meaningful about whether kids can read, write and do basic maths and science? There's lots of assessment is a real art, and it's both a science and a something more creative, and to design effective assessments is hugely challenging. But there's a whole passage in the book where I cite kind of the 5 main critiques of assessments, but none of them mean that you shouldn't do assessment. And our failure to assess in kind of standard ways nationally, compulsorily, at all throughout all of schooling, let alone in primary and secondary schooling, is much of the explanation for our entrenched inequality in New Zealand. Because, of course, if you're a primary school teacher working in, I don't know, take Northland, for example, you've got a cohort, 20 children in front of you, and you've got parents' evening coming up and you want to tell the parents how they're doing, you tend to compare with the child in front of you with their cohort in the school. And unfortunately, that's probably not a nationally representative sample. So you might be telling these parents that their child is, top of the class or middle of the class or whatever. But unless you have an opportunity a frequent opportunity, not necessarily every year, but that forces you to benchmark your cohort against a national cohort, you don't necessarily know how they're doing. And so it's this failure and this kind of, again, it's born from this idea that everything should be flexible and individualized and about individual children, that we've shunned national standardized mandatory testing in New Zealand. And that itself is a cause of inequality and inequity in outcomes for children, because we're not holding all schools to the same standards.
Yeah, there's quite an irony to that. I mean, it kind of brings us to this topic of child-centered education, which can be defined in many ways. And I know in your report you acknowledge that at one end it's trivially true that we want an education system that's child-centered because we're trying to educate children. But that's not what the proponents of that philosophy really mean, of course.
I don't know if you can use the word trivially, though, can you?
Oh, that's true.
It's
too difficult.
There was something in this.
Do you remember that the history exam where they used the word trivial and everybody was up in arms because the 17-year-olds who were supposed to be setting that assessment didn't know what trivial meant.
Yeah, and unfortunately, our national assessment body rolled over in response to their petitions saying that it was unfair to have included that that word.
Yes, indeed. So, I mean, the irony that I'm referring to, I think, is that on one hand, there's a kind of pretense coming from the child-centered philosophy that all children are equally capable at everything. There's very little acknowledgement of differences in propensities and abilities and so on. And yet that very philosophy leads to an exacerbation of inequality and of outcome for children, because if you make the assumption that children are able to direct their own educations, which seems to be more or less a common theme for all the variants of child-centered education, of course, the ones who have a lot of cultural capital, who have educated parents, who have access to a lot of resources, who are well fed, who are not under psychological pressure and so on, will thrive relatively well, and those without those resources will flounder. And so I think there's a fairly direct line from that philosophy to the kinds of inequalities you've drawn attention to. Exactly.
And, on the one level, child centrism is a no-brainer. That's what we want. But it's my report is arguing for a corrective shift, because this idea has just been taken to such an extreme in New Zealand. I mean, it's remarkable, the fact that there is absolutely no standardized assessment, that our curriculum is so utterly vacuous. The social studies, social science curriculum for the whole of primary and secondary school. So that's your history, geography, politics, economics, social studies. It fits on an A4 page in New Zealand.
Yes.
So, I mean, that gives listeners a sense of just how vacuous and empty it is. It is entirely down to, it's a lottery what you end up learning in school. And it's, luckily there are still some schools and teachers in New Zealand who quietly ignore the thrust of the advice in the New Zealand curriculum, which is to be sort of agnostic about content and just focus on skills like critical thinking. And they quietly get on and do what they've always done and they know works, which is to teach a coherent body of knowledge from these particular subject disciplines. But unfortunately, that will only reduce over time as more and more teachers in the profession were educated themselves under these child-centered methodologies. And of course, those teachers tend to end up in teaching in more traditional schools, which serve these more professional middle-class families. And so this horrible cycle of exacerbating inequity just continues.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, because I guess the people who are pushing or have been pushing child-centered learning, I mean, they're looking at this from a political point of view, maybe, but I mean, it's not invalid for that, right? And I think in some ways you sort of sympathize with this, right? Because I think even you think that in the past there was too much rote learning and it could be too top-down. It's just gone too far the other way, right?
It's completely about getting the balance right. And, we've been lucky in the last 20, 30 years. There have been huge advances, Michael will be able to talk to, in cognitive science. And we now have a much clearer understanding of how learning occurs and the role of long-term memory, i.e., stuff that we've learned and committed to long-term memory, in our ability to think critically and solve problems and so forth. We have this very limited working memory, which can store, I believe, the literature, there's some debate between about 4 and 7 items in working memory at any one time. And no matter how clever you are, there's no way around that other than to commit knowledge to long-term memory so that you have these kind of bigger chunks of information rattling around in your short-term memory, it's in your working memory. And this really does help us to help explain why all the rote learning and the memorizing stuff is so essential to skilled performance. And of course, rote learning, back in the day probably was a pretty grim prospect for children sat in rows. But the skill of the teacher, and part of the fun of the job, in my own experience, teaching maths is the perfect example of this, is to find ways to make learning the quadratic equation or your number bonds entertaining and engaging. And it's perfectly possible. And actually lots of modern technology makes that easier.
It's true, although I think there's a few things there. One is we need to do more to cultivate attention in very young children at the preschool level, the ability to focus for a reasonable period of time, because there is no getting away from the fact that certain things just have to be practiced and practiced and practiced, and that will never be particularly interesting in and of itself. You're right, Briar, to point out the limitations of working memory, and just to fill that in a bit, the key is to render as much as possible automatic by practice, and then it doesn't occupy working memory anymore. It becomes an automatic process that you're able to deploy it at will without concentrating on it too much, and that frees up cognitive resources to learn other things that depend on those functions that have now been automatized. But as well, I'm not really sure that we should look at things as a dichotomy between, or even a spectrum between, what is child-centered and this kind of Gradgrindian rote learning. It's actually a set of processes that go to the purposes of education itself. And we can talk. I'm very interested in exploring what you, Briar, see as the many possible purposes of education, but one of them, I think, on the individual level that we could agree on, is the cultivation of independence. We want people to become independent, free functioning adults, but obviously they don't start off that way. So we can see things as moving, as people develop, towards more and more self-directed learning as they're able to do that. But there will always be things along the way that they encounter where they need some more direct instruction, where they need to be helped. And we all, even as adults, are beginners at something from time to time and need to have that direct input of an expert. So to me, it's actually, if we think about what it takes at any point to increase a child's independence, And sometimes that's actually, in the moment, a lack of independence. It's actually they need to be supported, they need to be instructed in order to build the skills and automatize the knowledge that's required to move towards a greater degree of independence and ability to direct their own learning.
Yeah, well, we should definitely talk about the purpose of education.
So let's do that. What for you? I mean, obviously, there's not necessarily any one. We can think of psychological purposes and social purposes and so on. But tell us how you see that.
Well, I've always been really struck by the thinking about life before we had schooling. We lived in caves, and there's an evolutionary psychologist, David Geary, who made what seems when you learn about it obvious, but it hadn't occurred to me before, the distinction between biologically primary and secondary knowledge. So we've all seen and been amazed by how little children learn to speak and learn to walk and use their fingers and become dexterous and learn to recognize facial expressions without explicit instruction. They pick those things up very naturally. And a lot of the emphasis on child-centrism that now pervades all of primary and increasingly secondary schooling in New Zealand comes from early years, where it makes a lot of sense to just kind of create an environment in which children will unfurl almost naturally before our eyes. And there's a kind of, these naturalistic metaphors are entirely appropriate when you're dealing with very small children. And they're, of course, especially appealing in a country like New Zealand, which is so blessed by nature and has this kind of affinity through, particularly with Maoridom, which is another topic which we may get into, with nature, and this idea of the child unfurling before our eyes is very persuasive. But as Geary points out, things like reading and writing, the alphabet system and the number system are modern inventions of societies. And we have not evolved over millennia to be able to understand the alphabet and the number system. So if we're not taught those things explicitly in school or by an adult, then we don't just pick them up in the way that we do pick up lots of these biologically primary skills. And so that distinction is really important. But unfortunately, it's, certainly nobody taught me about that during my teacher training. I picked that up some years later.
It's something I've realised reasonably recently, actually, that you'd be aware of the distinction between, the term that's used is the reading wars, in fact, because things have become so acrimonious in the realm of theory about how we should teach children to read, that it's degenerated into kind of conflict, not physical conflict, obviously, but the fundamental error, I think, from the whole language side is exactly what you've just said. So, if we go back to the early 1950s, the linguist Noam Chomsky, I think the right word is demolished B.F. Skinner's theory about language acquisition, because for Skinner, everything was learned in this kind of behaviorist way, that there's an environment that we interact with and it rewards or punishes us, and that gives reinforcement to learning. And so he wrote a book called Verbal Behaviour, in which he described a behaviorist process for learning language. And Chomsky reviewed that book and in a few pages completely tore apart that idea of how language is acquired. And I think Chomsky's central insight was that language is a physiological function. It's not a technology the way literacy is. And but then...
And by language, you mean spoken language?
I mean oral language, spoken language. Yeah. That's right. It's a human universal. There's no human beings who haven't got a language, and languages are translatable into one another. It's built into us to acquire language in a way that literacy is not, which, as you said, is a latecomer on the scene. And so it's a huge mistake to extrapolate Chomsky's correct insight about oral language to literacy and think that if you just put children in an environment with lots of literary materials that they'll somehow acquire literacy the way they acquired oral language.
Yeah, and there's a huge mass of cultural heritage or scientific heritage, which we sort of take for granted.
Yes.
And I liked your point. I think you quote the scholar Christodoulou on this, talking about the Greeks. Of course, I like this point. It says, the Greeks were taking baths for centuries before Archimedes worked out that an object that is wholly or partially immersed in a fluid is buoyed up by a force equal to the weight of the fluid displaced by the object. Once these breakthroughs are made, then we are all able to understand and use them if they are explained to us. If they are not explained to us and we are left to discover them from ourselves, many people will never discover them or will have very imperfect understandings of them. So yeah, it's interesting. So basically, if we go too far down this path of children should work out the world for themselves, what we're essentially doing is asking them to reinvent the wheel. And not only the wheel, we're asking them to reinvent calculus,
Yes.
and to reinvent the systems of writing and things like that. And it took a long time for these systems to come into being and to be developed. And, that's just 3 or 4 things. And we could talk about computers and all the discoveries we made about the human body and the way the universe works. And these were hard won. Right, so it's not only completely unrealistic from the point of view of how much knowledge, how much learning there is out there, but it's also kind of asking every average New Zealand school child, if you want to put it this way, to be like Isaac Newton and Descartes and all these people who made great discoveries. It's a big ask.
Yes, of course. But can we come back to what you see as the purposes of education? So
I think off the back of that, ultimately we invented schooling to start filling in these gaps, because society, through developing the number system and the alphabet and scientific method and so forth, became more complicated. And in order to thrive and flourish in these more complex societies, we got to the point where you couldn't just it wasn't enough just to learn around the campfire and from your families. And so we invented schooling to fill in those gaps and to provide a place where children would acquire these more technical things that you need in order to thrive in society. So that's kind of the underlying idea. And I've been reading about a concept. It's a German word of Bildung.
Yes.
Which has a meaning, something like formation, which is this idea of kind of building your character. And I'm drawn to this idea, which one gathers doesn't have a natural translation into the English language, which is possibly part of the trouble for the English-speaking world, that we've increasingly turned schooling into a kind of utilitarian pursuit. And these ideas that we're preparing children for the future of work, and they need 21st century skills to thrive in the workplace has, it's widely accepted. Politicians across the political spectrum talk about education in these terms now, and it's very little challenged. And I think inevitably parents sort of buy into it too, and it has become the go-to answer to, well, what's the purpose of schooling? And
yes.
Actually, I think the purpose of schooling is something much more uplifting, much more far-reaching. We want to introduce children to Matthew Arnold's phrase, the best that's been thought and said, and to enable them to stand, like James was talking, on the shoulders of giants and see further as a result of the discoveries of our ancestors, including Newton and Isaac and the great writers from literature and thinkers from our heritage and our collective heritage the world over. And that has been horribly obscured by this kind of utilitarian approach.
Yes, it's an irony in a way that you've been accused of a neoliberal approach to education, and here you are actually arguing directly against that we're not educating people for purely economic outcomes. And I'm sure we'd all agree it's important that people can make a living, but that's only, in some ways the most asinine purposes for education.
Yeah, and in the past, those outcomes were happy byproducts of a kind of Bildung-style approach to schooling.
That's right.
The late philosopher Roger Scruton had a great analogy for what happens when you start to twist the purpose of something. He talked about a football game. That ultimately the purpose of a game of football is to win, to get goals in the back of the net and to win. There are lots of other things that go with playing football. You know, there's the camaraderie and the exercise and the release of endorphins and the practice in teamwork and there's the entertainment factor for the onlookers and so forth. There's all these other things that go alongside football. But if you allow any one of those alternative purposes, we tend to do it these days when we shield children from competition. You know, if you decide that the purpose of football is no longer to win, but that it's to create a sense of well-being and inclusion or something, then that ultimate goal of ultimate purpose of scoring goals and winning gets sidelined, and your chances of winning are reduced. You know, the All Blacks go out there very clearly with the aim of winning the game. And those other things that happen are happy byproducts, but they have never been allowed to take over the core purpose of the game. And unfortunately, in schooling, we have allowed the happy byproduct of employability to kind of take over. And that's inevitably to the detriment of the ultimate purpose, which is something more like Bildung, the kind of formation of character, exposure to the best that's been thought and said.
I like that you brought up Matthew Arnold, because he's come up actually twice already in this podcast series. So it's great to have him on again. Can I raise a note of caution about this Bildung view? Actually, you might also use the ancient Greek word paideia, which had a similar sense of sort of all-round education. But paideia also had connotations of a cultural education.
Yes. Doing
paideia was to become Greek. We have sources that tell us if you have paideia, then you are Greek, no matter what your actual heritage is. So the concern I have is basically just that there's a danger of having an idea of education that's too thick, right? So if we focus on skills, and I take your point that skills involve knowledge, then there's a certain neutrality that is maintained. If we think about not so much Matthew Arnold, but Thomas Arnold, his father, I mean, he was a Christian schoolmaster. Nothing wrong with that. But of course, there's a certain view of education, which is to instill character, that can be too thick for some people in a liberal society. Or, I mean, I think it should be allowed, of course. You should be allowed to raise your child or have an education in whatever way you choose. But there are concerns around that. And I raise them because one of our concerns in this podcast is also that there may be conceptions of education right now that are becoming too thick, too substantive. So there are lots of proponents now of social justice, and you should train students not only to acquire skills and knowledge about the past or about science or whatever, but really to take a certain view of the world. And I understand that a lot of people have a sincere belief that those things are good and true, as religious educators do about their faiths. But there is a concern around that, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. On paideia, was that because the Greeks didn't have exposure to civilizations beyond themselves, or was it an active choice that you would be educated?
Probably fair to say
citizen?
They were fairly chauvinistic about their culture. They would have thought it was much better than any other culture around at the time.
Yeah, most cultures have been like that. No, they were aware of other cultures like the Persians and the great civilizations of the Near East, and also the people they referred to as barbaroi, barbarians to the north and west. But once you move into the Hellenistic period, so after Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire, and his empire then splits up into kingdoms, the Greeks are kind of top dogs in a lot of areas. And what we see is a process of Hellenization, so people kind of opting into Greek culture. And in that context, where there are sort of non-Greeks doing Greek-like things, the Greeks seem to or some of the Greeks seem to say, or take this view that if you are kind of doing Greek-like things, you're part of our world. And the Greek-like things are paideia. So things like gymnastics and music. And I also think that if you go back a few decades, the British Empire was a bit like this too. There's like, if you're playing cricket and doing classics, maybe, and doing things like that, you can opt in. Well, that's really the classics thing is the sort of elite British world. But there are ways of opting into that culture which can gain you recognition. I mean, I think part of this is partly why the All Blacks are so damn good at rugby, because I think there's always an effort on the periphery to prove your mettle in the home culture.
Yeah. It's interesting that process of Hellenization included the Romans who had actually conquered the Greeks militarily, but were then, in turn, in a way, conquered by the Hellenic culture. They took it on in a big way, didn't they? And saw, I guess, well-to-do Romans wanted Greek tutors for their children and so on.
Yeah, that's what you said there is a quotation from Horace, which I'm sure you did that deliberately.
Naturally.
Basically captured Greece, captured the Romans. Yeah. In other words, that, Greece was conquered militarily, but then it conquered the Romans.
Which really does show something about the power of that culture, because that's quite rare. Normally a conquering power will assimilate the conquered people and draw them into its own culture. Naturally, there's always some kind of to and fro culturally, but in the case of the Romans, they adopted the Greek religion. They gave the gods different names, but they adopted a whole lot of Greek ways of thinking and developed them over time. And I'm wondering, this idea of paideia or Bildung, I'm not quite sure how similar. They probably have some differences as well. But you were talking about, James, the idea that a curriculum can be too thick or too thin. I'm wondering if an alternative way to look at it is actually that a purpose of education is to provide a platform for young people whereby we convey to them the culture as best we can as it is now. So that will be the disciplines of the culture, whether that's mathematics and history or science and so on. It might be, obviously literacy, the ability to express oneself, and all of the kind of softer skills that will be picked up in a social environment like a school if it's well ordered. But that's not necessarily to say that we want them to go on just being like that all their lives, that they'll be set in stone at the age of 18 when they leave school and now they've assimilated the culture and they can just go off and be
part of it.
They will be part of it, but actually then what we've given them is the power to critique the culture as well. Having been given that platform, then we don't expect them just to be mindless proponents of it, but actually to develop it further, because cultures are evolving things. And now they're in a powerful position to do that because they know, the best that's been thought and said by this culture. And then they're in a position to critique even the best that's been thought and said and to develop it for themselves. And that seems to me to break that conundrum of, how thick and how thin. But actually it's not a question of that. It's like the best we can do to convey the culture as it is, with the expectation that then they'll go off and do things with that.
Yeah, and of course,
for them to decide.
Plenty revolutionaries, people that have generated great change in society, have had traditional educations. They're not mutually exclusive. The idea that you would be inculcated in your collective culture and then go on to, in dramatic ways, to change it. But there does seem to be a preference from some to change the world by simply not passing on our heritage and our kind of collective wisdom. I hesitate to use kind of right-left political distinctions because I really object to the idea that advocating for a national curriculum that ensures all children acquire a broad base of knowledge of their collective culture has anything to do with politics.
A particular political orientation.
Yeah. If we care about equity and things like social justice, then we should be ensuring that every child acquires their birthright through schooling. But there is this idea on the left that perhaps the way to change the world and to create a kind of a better world and a utopian society is to simply shun what came before and to start afresh.
Yes, I really enjoyed actually Jordan Peterson's treatment of the balance, the necessary balance between liberalism and conservatism in a culture, and in any culture that if you have too much liberalism, you just have this constant idea that everything needs to be thrown out and started again, which doesn't work. On the other hand, a culture that's overly conservative is stultified. It's ossified. It doesn't develop anymore. And either way is a recipe for collapse. So what you actually want is a healthy tension between conservatism and liberalism. And it seems to me that we can do that by erring on the side of conservatism when people are young, in part because the psychology of young people is liberal. So there's a counterbalance there against their propensities to go off and do things before they know anything.
Is it?
Is what?
Are the young necessarily liberal, do you think?
Well, I don't necessarily mean politically liberal. I mean, even physiologically, when we're young, our brains are more plastic. They learn more quickly. They're less set in their ways. You know, we are less set in our ways because we haven't been around that long, and we're very open to new ideas. And older people, I think, you know, certainly for myself, as I move through life, I'm less inclined to radically change, although I still do change my mind a fair bit about things. But my job is to think and change my mind, so I keep in practice with that. But I do think that there's too much of a propensity in our culture at the moment to see young people as being the architects of the future before they know anything. And I think that's a mistake. I think it was Nietzsche who said that that freedom can only come after a long period of unfreedom, which is to say, if we put that into educational terms, that you need to take on board a lot. You know, all of these, as you said before, James, you know, we can't expect people to invent for themselves 2,500 years of cultural development. We have to give it to them. And if we can do that, then we've given them power to actually speak and make change from a position of knowledge instead of a position of ignorance.
Exactly. So there's the conservative element in education. I think Brian would agree in the sense that it's just the fact that we've learned a lot of things in the past. We're not starting from a blank slate. And so to some extent, education has to be education in the past. Even if we're talking about scientific discovery, we are learning what Newton discovered or what Darwin discovered. But then we use this knowledge partly just to give students knowledge, but partly to build skills. And the skills will then be available to you to use in whatever way you see fit. And that might be to become a reactionary or to shore up the status quo. And it might also be to overthrow things. But there's very little argument, it seems to me, for ignorance, for not knowing what happened in the past or the way things are now, even if you want to overthrow things, or especially if you want to change things.
Yes.
Because it helps to know things if you want to actually change things effectively, on a political level, but also on an intellectual level. So, you know, Darwin, people like Darwin and Descartes, who are, you know, they're responsible for two of the most dramatic intellectual changes in the early modern and the modern periods. I mean, Darwin didn't write The Origin of Species from the position of someone who had never opened a geology textbook or had never, studied speciation and things like that.
Right.
You know, so he was a master of the technical skills that he needed in order to have these thoughts, which then sort of broke things wide open. And you could say that for, you know, the people who studied the Bible and the Renaissance. They knew Hebrew, they knew Greek, and if they hadn't, you know, their arguments wouldn't have gained any traction because people would have just said, well, you don't understand what you're talking about. So I like this. So that just speaks to the point of it seems like a paradox that you need a certain amount of discipline and maybe even you might say illiberalism when you're talking about children in order to make children capable of liberalism, you know, capable
Yes.
of freedom. And so that I think it does make education a politically neutral endeavor. And I like this quotation you put at the beginning of your first chapter. It's from someone called E.D. Hirsch. He says, "I would label myself a political liberal and an educational conservative, or perhaps more accurately, an educational pragmatist. Political liberals really ought to oppose progressive educational ideas because they have led to practical failure and greater social inequity." Right? So that's the same point, really, that you need to actually do things which work in the sense of giving children the skills to become independent adults. Because without the skills to become independent adults, liberalism just fails. And I mean liberalism with a small L, right? In the sort of Matthew Arnold humanist liberal sense.
Yeah, and I actually opened the introductory chapter with a quote from John Dewey, who's the American kind of godfather of progressive education.
Yep.
And he says, what does freedom mean? And what are the conditions under which it's capable of realization? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And it is a paradox. I had a lovely email. I've been inundated with emails since writing this report. And one English teacher described this paradox whereby his own childhood at the hands of some, I believe, some farmers up north was, pretty strict, and there was a strong framework of expectations around childhood, and it was kind of traditional, and yet his recollection of childhood was of utter freedom, despite these boundaries that had been put around him. And he now looks at the education, the upbringing his siblings give to their own children, and it seems so remarkably different. And we indulge children far more. And we listen to their choices. He described some anecdotes of, you ate what was on the table. There was no expectation that you would be given a choice about what you would eat,
yes,
or what shoes you would wear. You just wore the pair of shoes that you had. And some combination of increased affluence, something to do with parents' guilt at the fact that often both parents are at work, and just wider social attitudes of child-centrism that go beyond just schooling and education, that have kind of pervaded society as a whole, have meant that within a couple of generations we are raising, I try not to include myself in that but we have changed the way we treat children, and it is much more child-centered. And of course, in some ways that will be good, but in other ways it will have profound changes, and it will change dramatically the way children experience well-being and what they expect from schooling and from their life, and what it means to be happy. And that idea of freedom, giving children freedom now when they are children, on the basis that will be good preparation for freedom of as adults, just doesn't make sense to me. And it's concurrent with this idea that if we want kids to be creative, we should spend time in school practicing creativity, or that if we want them to be independent adults and lifelong learners, we should spend our time in school doing independent tasks. And unfortunately, it's a confusion of the ends and the means of education. And it is a paradox, and it's counterintuitive. But if you want children to be free, if you want children to grow up to become free as adults, actually, we do have to put boundaries around them. We do have to frame childhood, and we do have to reduce their freedom as children, because actually, in the long run, that's what will make them free. But that paradox has been lost somewhat, the idea of it.
I wonder if it's because, in part, our society has become so safe in many ways, and we've come to take that for granted. It's been a couple of generations since there's been a serious war that we've been involved in. We've lived through a time of ever-increasing prosperity, and perhaps we've lost sight of the fact that the world is a potentially dangerous place, and perhaps, even 150 years ago, when women routinely died in childbirth, before antibiotics, when people could die of random diseases, when young men were killed in their tens of thousands in wars, there was a recognition that actually we had to educate people to survive in a dangerous world. And we can be self-indulgent about it, or at least we think we can now. But actually, by so doing, I think we threaten the safety that we've created and the prosperity that we've created, because actually we make people more fragile and not tougher.
Yeah, because as Jonathan Haidt has so effectively explained, children, humans, we are anti-fragile. The more
Yes.
exposure we have
Word,
as young children to things that challenge us, the more likely we are to develop thick skin and be able to deal with them. And so, we tend to measure well-being and mental health and everything a lot more nowadays. But ultimately, we'll never know to what extent these are kind of chicken and egg phenomenon, and that our increased propensity to coddle children and to respect their individual choices when they're tiny actually feeds this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely got two people who agree with that strongly here, and Michael and me. But so the question is, I guess, just trying to play devil's advocate. At what point does it become tyrannical, or at what point does it become callous? Because I agree with Haidt and Luciana quite strongly that we've created a world in which students, especially, are coddled, I suppose is the word. But people would push back at that and say, well, people do have serious troubles in life, and it's good to be sensitive to these things and sympathetic. And I mean, I had issues of a minor sort when I was a student. A lot of us do. And then on the liberalism point, it's interesting because it is a difficult balance in the sense that if you take a 5-year-old kid, everyone agrees that that kid basically has no rights for their own good, right? If you see a 5-year-old reaching his hand out towards a hot stovetop, everyone in their right mind is going to whisk the hand away. They're not going to say, may I whisk your hand away? If you then look at a 40-year-old, if Michael lights up a cigarette and I just take it out of his hand, he's going to be pissed off at me, rightly, because I'm not respecting his autonomy. So the question is where do we draw the line? Because there is a risk with some of these arguments to say, well, okay, you may be 25, but it's for your own good. I'm going to force you to do ancient Greek because I actually believe this isn't even a joke.
We don't.
I would like to force a lot of people to do ancient Greek because I think it would be for their own good.
I wish someone forced me when I was 15 to do ancient Greek.
Well, I wish they tried to force me to do more maths, but I was pig-headed. But anyway, so I regret that. But anyway, so I wanted to flag these concerns and come back to them. Well,
you're totally right. And, this is a dilemma for parents and educators too. But I think what you're both saying, and unfortunately we probably agree on, is that the idea that children are ready to choose in secondary school, let alone primary school, what these things that they have to learn are, is probably deeply unhelpful. And like I have many things that I wish someone had just sat me down and said, you're going to do this. You don't realize it now, but you're going to have to do it. Unfortunately, my parents did do a fair amount of that, but I wish they'd gone further. And this idea that going back to the utilitarianism of today's schooling, aspirations for schooling, the idea that if you're going to go off and become an electrician or a meat processor, automatically means that there is no point in you learning Greek or history or science is so damaging.
Very
and
elitist
how limiting
as well.
And elitist, yeah. If you actually, we need to separate the purpose of gaining employment and the economic needs of our particular, the country that we live in at a particular time, from the purpose of schooling, which is something much more uplifting.
One would hope so. I think we can, parents and teachers are flawed human beings, and so we all have limitations to our judgment. But if we're guided by the principle of bringing up children to be ultimately free and self-actualized adults, with the knowledge that in order to do that, we need to limit their freedom when they're young, then we won't go too far wrong. We will make some mistakes, and everybody makes mistakes as parents, and teachers make mistakes. But if that's our motivating force, and it's backed by the knowledge of the science of learning and of the development of healthy psychology and so on, then that's the right road to be on. And then it becomes actually a matter of devolving freedom to the child when they're ready for it, according to our best judgment. So it's not that we limit all choice in 5-year-olds. Would you like to read this story or that story?
Right.
That's a good choice for it to make when you're 5. Yeah. Or even, would you like to wear your blue socks or your green socks today?
Would you like to read Herodotus or Thucydides? That's the kind of freedom I'm into. Yeah.
Both, please. Yeah. But then, as they become teenagers, they can exercise a bit more choice. And those, you chose not to study mathematics, and we can all make choices that we regret later. But that was a valid choice at the time because you took up a different path that's worked out pretty well for you. You learned, you speak ancient Greek, and you speak Latin, and you speak German, and you did these other things that have stood you in good stead as well. And nobody can master everything. So, we do have to make choices which road to go down. Are you going to learn the piano or the violin? Maybe, I learned the violin. In some ways I wish I'd learned the piano, but I didn't. You can always look back and wish you'd made a different choice. But the question is more broadly, are we setting people up to be these kind of autonomous people who have a sense of power in the world, who can have a sense of effectiveness, that they're able to live their lives in a way where they're in harmony with others and can stand up for themselves.
Yes, and it's very difficult to choose whether you want to be a historian or an English literature scholar, or indeed, this is kind of an elitist way I'm thinking right now because I'm in a university, but it's very difficult to choose whether you want to be a school teacher or an administrator or a lawyer if you don't know how to write a proper essay or you don't know how to punctuate. That's the point, really, isn't it? That there's a sort of core of skills, and I think this is one of the main fallacies you've identified. Those skills are dependent on a body of knowledge, and then once you have those can actually give you more choices in life.
Yes, that's right. So again, I don't really see it as a sort of spectrum between kind of authoritarian education and all too liberal education, but rather not a spectrum, but a philosophy whereby we want to devolve freedom to children. We don't want to rule over them. We don't. My father was whacked for spelling mistakes when he was at school. That's a terrible thing to do to a child, and no profit at all in that. He did learn to spell, but he would have learned to spell a different way. And he was educated by, psychologically damaged war veterans, which is why that happened. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about a kind of conservative approach to education. It's actually with love for the child that we're doing that, with the very best wishes for their ultimate freedom and emancipation.
Yeah, so we're sort of arguing for a balance inevitably, and that we hold these things correctly in tension. But I do feel like as though the propensity to push freedom increasingly down into lower and lower years of schooling is probably partly born from a ultimate misunderstanding about the purpose of schooling and this problem of it being taken over by the kind of vocational aims. If somebody's going to go on to become an engineer or a doctor, they will study these vocational courses at university, but school should be the place where they enrich themselves with poetry and literature and knowledge of the things that have probably as well as the skills that James just identified. You need to be able to write an essay and punctuate. But actually, school is the time to expose children to the wonders of the world that they've been born into. And a failure to do that and to forget that ultimate purpose leaves the door open for this increasing push towards skills and independence and these things earlier and earlier.
Yeah, I do think that what you said there is an aspect of education, one that I'd like to defend, because actually a couple of times I've been asked to speak to incoming students about their time at university and sort of make a pitch for classics in the humanities. And one of the things I say is just that within 3 years, most of you will be going out into the world of work. You'll get a job, you might have a family. At any rate, you'll be very busy. And you probably won't have a lot of time to do serious thinking about the human past, or to think about a beautiful work of art, whether it's Shakespeare or Mozart. And so in some ways, university isn't training. University is a time in which you can explore these things. And it might be one of the only extended stretches of time in your life. So take advantage of it. And I actually, more and more, I think of the reading of Latin and Greek literature that we do in the classics department in this way. I think in the past, there was this idea that we would be training people to read Latin and Greek, which are very difficult languages actually, and then people would go home and of an evening they'd pick up the Iliad and read it. Maybe that was the case with some of Matthew Arnold's friends. I think nowadays it doesn't really happen. So I think of it now in the way that when I was really into Buddhism in California, I remember I had this teacher, I was in this group that sort of emphasized, you're not training to become more virtuous by meditating. You're not gaining spiritual points or involved in spiritual progress. When you're meditating, that's just meditating. So that is virtue in itself. So the way of looking at it, if we take it back to reading Latin and Greek at university, is just that we have spaces of time called classes in which Greek literature gets read. I mean, that's really where people read the Iliad nowadays, is in classrooms. So it's not so much a training thing, it's a creating space in which these works of art can actually be studied, because in the ordinary world, it's not happening. And I think you could extend that to lots of different fields of endeavor.
Although maybe just sort of picking up on that, a thought that I'm having is that it's a kind of meta training in a way, because whether you're reading the Iliad and thinking about, the motivations of Homer and what those stories really capture, or whether you're studying calculus or whether you're studying science and physics and the astrophysics, the way the universe is, what you're doing is training a critical faculty of thinking. And I guess that brings us to the question of how we maintain a democratic culture. Because even if that 3 years is the greatest period of intellectual freedom in your life, and after that you're busy with jobs and family and so on, you're still a citizen of a democratic society where you have to be able to think through issues in order to cast a vote in a way that will result in good social change or good social conservation, for that matter. And might we see education as being something that leads to the ability to do that?
Yes and no. I mean, so this is something I thought about a bit in the sense that I actually think that the kinds of qualities that entitle us to participation as democratic citizens are more like Chomsky and generative grammar than they are like writing. And so here I'm following an ancient Greek philosopher, Protagoras, who in Plato's dialogue called Protagoras, he tells a story about what he thinks humans are like. And he says that basically the Titans have all these things they have to hand out to all the animals, like claws and horns and things like that. And they just forget to hand out things like horns and claws to humans. So humans are defenseless. So what do? Well, Prometheus gives them fire, that helps a bit. But then what they really need is the skills to live together. And so according to this myth that Protagoras tells, Hermes actually instills every human with a sense of justice and a sense of shame or a conscience. And these are the skills that allow humans to live together. And I think Protagoras is really building a theory of democracy. And he's basically saying that when it comes to these social and moral qualities, we all have a kind of equality. So that's this is a kind of a long digression, but I just the reason I'm raising a note of caution is just that if we follow this thought that education is what sort of enables us to do democracy too far, then we get to a reasonably undemocratic place, right? Because then it looks like the people who went to university have more of a say, and then we start saying that the Brexit vote wasn't.
But I think I'd come back to what Briar was saying, and it's not just the people that go to university. We need to be talking about school in that regard as well, where everybody goes.
Yeah,
and to respond to your point, I mean, yes, I agree that the ability to live together is that's built into us as organisms, but the ability to think critically isn't. That's a different thing. The ability to critique an idea has to be educated. It's not built into us. In fact, we're all too prone to bias, to falling in love with our own ideas, to being dominated by the ideas of our peers, and so on. And so, I think we need to educate people as a foil to all of those much more natural phenomena of falling in line with dominant discourse.
And that's where I think you and I are on exactly the same page of as many of the people that my book appears to criticize, who have been pushing this idea that we have to teach critical thinking. I think everybody wants that. My problem is just that the route to become a critical thinker looks very different to practicing critical thinking.
Well, it doesn't exist on its own.
It's not a generic skill.
It's baked into our cultural disciplines, and that's how you learn it. You learn it through mathematics or science or history or learning about Homer, all of those things. And critical thinking isn't one thing either. I mean, it's one thing to be sort of critical in the realm of the humanities. It's quite a different thing to be critical in the realm of science. There's things in common, but they're not the same.
I mean, this may be a slightly cynical and partisan comment, but I think that in the humanities, especially, the word critical has come to be used in a certain sense, like in critical theory.
Oh, yeah.
And it basically means, to try and sort of understand this worldview, but, they think there's a right-wing establishment or a capitalist establishment, or whatever, and they're criticizing that. So the theory is critical in that sense. And then there's a slight sort of blending of that with critical thinking, which basically everybody can get behind. But it's a bit dangerous because, then you get into this territory where critical thinking means sort of a training in anti-capitalism. Yeah. But this goes back to the point I was saying before, right? It's like, if you take this view that if you go too far down the path of thinking that education is not just about training, but it's about character and the good, then it's up to people to start subtly imposing their view of the good. And this is what I fear is happening now, right? That people are saying, we need to train people in critical thinking. Of course, capitalism is bad. Of course, we're destroying the planet. So we need to train people in being against capitalism and, et cetera. That's a problem, right? I mean, maybe this doesn't really speak to your report. But,
there's a British writer, Phil Beadle, from the left. He's kind of hard left. He's written a book recently called The Fascist Painting. I haven't read it. I've heard him talking about it on the radio. And he's talking about this problem of what is the good, and what is a curriculum that imparts powerful knowledge. What does it look like? He's talking about it in the UK context, which is somewhat less fraught than in New Zealand, because we don't have the complexity of Mātauranga Māori in the UK, which is something that if you're gonna design a national curriculum for New Zealand that imparts powerful knowledge, you have to define what Māori knowledge that will include. And I suspect that part of the explanation for why New Zealand doesn't have a national curriculum, to all intents and purposes, is because that conversation has been avoided up till now by the ministry and others and politicians on the basis that it's seen as too fraught and too complex. I'm not naive in believing that the challenge that my book hands down to the ministry and to politicians of defining a canon of knowledge that all Kiwi children should learn will be straightforward. That is a national conversation that needs to happen, and it won't be straightforward. But Phil Beadle talks about it in a UK context where, and his concern is that we are actually referring to an elitist culture that is to the detriment of kind of working class culture. And as I say, I'm yet to read the book, but I suspect he's got some quite interesting insights there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm that brings to my mind Michael Young, who's another UK educational.
You mean Michael F.D. Young?
Michael F.D. Young.
Yes, not the meritocracy Michael Young.
No, Michael F.D. Young, he's from a school called Critical Realism, and I think he started off his in life agreeing with Beadle, but now he actually sees what he calls powerful knowledge as being the birthright of all children. It's certainly not a class thing, and in fact, what he defines powerful knowledge to be is that can emancipate you from your background. So if you are born into disadvantaged circumstances, it's that knowledge that can lift you out of those circumstances. And so therefore it's a mistake to say that we should just honour whatever children bring to school and leave it at that. I mean, it's not to say that we shouldn't, honour where they're coming from, but we don't necessarily want them to end up where they've come from. They should have more choice and power in life than that, and the way to give them that is to impart to them knowledge that allows them to abstract themselves from where they started.
Yes, so for Beadle, it's a symbolically violent act to impose high culture curriculum onto working class children, and he thinks that that there's a kind of covert assumption that some culture is superior, and that if you impose that through a national curriculum, you're replacing one form of culture, kind of in the UK context, it's a working class culture he's referring to, with another, and then of course when pressed on what he means by that, he thinks that it's destroying popular culture, things like trade unionism, and the institutions that he believes seek to improve equality of opportunity and stuff. It becomes
He sounds a fairly erudite chap. He's no doubt been to university. I'm wondering whether he feels that he's a working class person who has suffered this violence that's given him this opportunity to say these things, or has he always been of the higher culture and somehow he knows what it's like for working class people and thinks that maybe they should just stay where they are?
It's a very good question.
A lot of these things are things that we're talking about right now in the field of classics, actually. And I do think there's something to be said for this in the sense that, education is partly cultural. I mean, especially if we're talking about the humanities. So, within the humanities since the 90s, there's been all these wars about syllabuses, and who do we read, with the canon, basically. And I see some of their points. I do think that there are texts maybe we've read less than we should have. There should have in the past, and we can change the emphases to some extent. But then there are certain things that it's difficult to change. So, for example, I'm very happy to read more sort of ancient Chinese or canonical Chinese literature alongside the Western classics, especially if there's going to be like a global introduction to the humanities course. I think nowadays it has to be truly global, and there's no excuse for that not to happen. If we're marketing it as like a global humanities thing. If we're just doing Western Civ, I'm comfortable just doing Western Civ. But then, for example, going back to Newton or Leibniz, Newton and Leibniz discovered calculus. Calculus wasn't discovered, as far as we know, by somebody in Persia. Not to say that Persians didn't contribute anything to mathematics.
It was very nearly discovered by Archimedes.
Okay, so the Greeks were getting there. But what I'm saying is that there are some things that we need to learn about which just went through or happened in certain parts of the world and didn't happen in the others. And I could make similar points for Chinese culture. They discovered gunpowder and the compass and things like that. So I'm happy to be sort of equal opportunities, but it just is the case that sometimes you need to learn about things that happened in Europe for whatever reason. It's a huge historical question why there was such an efflorescence of economic progress and scientific knowledge in early modern Europe, starting from the early modern period and going into the 18th and 19th centuries. But it does seem to be a fact. So I guess try and be moderate. And I think, we need to try and do both of those things. Like we can expand our curricula in a way they weren't in the past, but there are also these irreducible facts about the way that human knowledge developed.
Yeah, I mean, we need, and if only the canon included that diversity, I think we wouldn't be having the battles that we're having today, because people would recognise that what is conceived of as the Western canon actually comes from many parts of the world. But perhaps it's even an ignorance of that encourages people to treat it as though it's a sort of Eurocentric thing.
Well, I also think that people nowadays, well, the critics in my field in particular, I think they have a tendency to attribute a lot of this to the narrowness of the curriculum in the past. They have a tendency to attribute a lot of that to nefariousness or to racism or whatever. And I think that some of it was that. I mean, there's no doubt about that. If you go back into the 19th century, you can find fairly clear expressions of cultural chauvinism and worse. But I also think that people forget how different the world was, even in the 1920s or 30s and 40s and 50s. I mean, I've had a little bit of an interest in Buddhism and things like that, and it's easy to forget how recently it was that even Buddhist scriptures, things like the Pali Text Society, that was a fairly recent development. So if you're in the 19th century, you just don't have the access to the text that we take for granted nowadays. There wasn't sort of the Oxford World Classic series or Penguin translations of these texts. It's still the case, actually, from what I know, from what I've heard from people who've done PhD in Arabic and things like that. There's a lot of classical literature in some of these languages which still hasn't been translated. So it's very easy to look back and say, oh, those guys were all racist because they weren't reading Confucius. But I mean, if you look at someone like Aquinas, if you go back far enough, I mean, the reason that Descartes wasn't reading Confucius wasn't because he was a racist, though he probably was. It was just that he didn't have the text to hand. And so that's why I say, like, now we have no excuse. But I do think that even going back a few decades, people did have the excuse. Like, they generally just didn't have the access to these texts.
So we're coming up to probably the end of our session. We'll just, maybe a good way to close is to ask you, Briar, what you see as the way ahead in New Zealand. What can we hope for in the next term of government? We've just had an election here, and it's been decisively won by Labor government. What can we do in the short term and in the medium term to bring about the sort of reform that you're looking for?
Well, a great stride was made under the coalition government a few years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when they announced that we were going to have a national curriculum for history, for New Zealand history. So the ministry is at work now. One gathers that it was the Prime Minister's intervention that forced the ministry to do that. And so it'll be a really interesting process to see what they've come up with, what the role of critical theories will be in that curriculum, and how it will support schools and teachers to teach a kind of balanced view of New Zealand's history. But I mean, if you're going to take on a curriculum area, a discipline in this challenge, then history's the trickiest one, probably, in the New Zealand context.
Certainly highly contested. You're describing it as a step forward, I presume, because knowledge will be specified.
That's what we've been told, yeah.
We have possible reason not to be too optimistic that it won't be quite ideologically determined.
Well, yeah, I mean, we wait to see. I mean, just in the last week in the UK, the Ministry of in England, the Ministry of Education issued some guidance to schools, making it very clear that if you were to teach critical race theory as fact, and without teaching it in a context as a theory, contested as it is, you would be breaking the law in a school in England. There's a black MP, a Conservative MP, who has stood up and vociferously defended this position, because there are, one gathers, reports from parents and other teachers reports of schools teaching critical race theory as fact in England. And so the government has taken a very firm line on this and provided advice. It will be interesting to see whether there's any similar advice in New Zealand, and on also whether there will be the kind of backlash that there has been by the kind of free speech movements back home. There's a home for me. Sorry, there's a new political party's been started up. I don't know whether the two of you have come across this chap, Lawrence Fox.
Oh yes,
his Reclaim Party, and that is pushed that. Although a fringe party, and we don't have MMP, so they'll probably never be in government. That has put pressure on the mainstream right of centre party, the Conservatives, the equivalent of National, to take on this kind of culture war that has been brewing since the terrible George Floyd incident. And so that'll be something interesting for us to watch in New Zealand. But
well, here, of course, we have ACT, and David Seymour has been joined by, I think, 9 colleagues in Parliament, the new Parliament, and I guess from my perspective, I have more hope that they will uphold the kind of values that we're talking about in terms of an open society than I do that the mainstream national opposition will. I think they've shown every sign of just doing what they've always done, which is to kind of move in whichever direction the political wind is blowing. But yes, it'll be interesting to see what they do come up with that history curriculum.
Yes,
I think I'd probably prefer a professional sanction against teachers than a legal one for sort of teaching badly. But
yeah, it's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because Michael and I are keen on supporting free speech, open inquiry, and things like that in educational institutions. So I do get a little bit nervous. I mean, the example you raise isn't the clearest one, but I mean, like in Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban at one point put out a decree banning gender studies departments, and I would be against that because even though I have doubts about some of the lines of research pursued in those departments, I mean they probably have doubts about my research too, right? So I educate, especially universities. I think you should be able to pursue the research you want. Having said that, when you're talking about school curricula, I think it makes sense to have some kind of evidence test, which is administered neutrally. And I do wonder whether some of the critical race theory is well grounded in empirical evidence.
You wonder.
Yeah, and it's not been banned. it's just the idea that you can't teach it as fact.
That's right.
That's the distinction that's important.
It's
of course, schools
that.
can and should talk about it.
That's right. So I think that actually that intervention is reasonably well designed. Actually, I mean, we could get into the whole thing about do you teach both sides of the argument when it comes to certain things, but we've probably done well enough for today. But I agree in this case. I think that this is obviously a theory, and it's actually a relatively young theory. And it's just become really big really quickly. So I think it especially makes sense in cases like this to be a little bit cautious and to make sure that students see both sides of the picture.
Yeah, and I think that is a role that ministries should have, whether we're a devolved system as we at least call ourselves in New Zealand, although I certainly contest the idea that New Zealand does have such a devolved schooling system as Tomorrow Schools is feted as. But that is the kind of support. It's really practical support that teachers need. You've got a day job. You don't have a day job you don't have time to become an expert in critical race theory and therefore make your own decisions about how, in what context you ought to be teaching it and saying about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Briar, for joining us today. It's been a really good conversation. It's nice to have somebody other than James and me in the room, because the one so far has just been us, and we have our own kind of lines of conversation, but this has really taken us in a different direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All the best for the forthcoming member of the family.
This didn't arrive during the podcast.
Oh, we thought it might, but yeah.
Done.